The early game in TFT is all about setting yourself up for success in the rest of the game. In set 9, there are a ton of different ways to force the early game you want, and we will cover all of that in this video by going over how to win in Lost Streak, when and what items to make, how the new Legends and Portal system changes the early game, and lastly, I'll cover how to play some of the strongest early game openers that transition well into late game comps. At the start of the game, everyone is short on money, and we need a lot of money to hit our late game comps and carries. Therefore, one of our goals in the early game is building up a strong economy. This is done by focusing on hitting interest points and also by having a continuous streak to get additional gold every turn. Good economy management paired with streaking can snowball very fast, so let's take a look at how to win streak first. Win streaking is all about playing a strong early game board to win as many consecutive rounds as possible. The ideal scenario is to have a 5 win streak coming into Krugs. This gives us 5 gold from winning 5 rounds, and 10 gold in total from streaking throughout those 5 rounds. Win streaking can only be achieved by playing a strong early game board, meaning you have many 2-star units, synergies that fit well together, while also picking augments and making items to further increase your board strength. Make sure to also be leveling in the early game when you're win streaking. Playing an extra unit will give you a lot more power, especially when it gives you bonus synergies. These intervals are to level 4 on 2-1 and level 5 on 2-5. If you did all of this properly, you should be level 5 on Krugs with 30 or more gold in the bank. Lost streaking is what you do in situations where you can't put together a win streak board, or you're playing a comp that uses the lost streak strategy in the early game. In that case, the goal is similar to win streaking, by having at least 40 gold by Krugs. To do this, you want to start making interest gold very early on, so we can start snowballing. Make sure to not hold on to unimportant units. If you are holding units on your bench, you need to have a good reason for it. You also generally want to avoid leveling in the early game, as you want to save up all your gold towards interest. Sometimes you can also sell off pairs to make interest gold, but this can be a bit risky as it might be harder to end the lost streak later. With this strategy, you will lose a lot of HP, but the most important thing to understand when lost streaking is that you are sacrificing your HP for gold and better carousel items. The extra gold and better items will allow you to get stronger later in the game, which is usually around stage 3-2, where you can roll level 6, or in stage 3-5, where you can do a level 7 all-in to turn around the game. Things don't always go as planned in TFT though, and sometimes you will break your streak on accident. That's called mixed streaking, and it's what you will be doing in most of your games. In that scenario, you want to focus on hitting your interest points the most, as you won't get much gold from the streaks anymore. But you don't want to ignore streaks entirely. Once your streak is broken, most of the time you want to try and play into it. For example, if you tried to lost streak and you lost 2-1 and 2-2, but ended up winning 2-3, now you most likely want to try and win 2-5 and 2-6 to play into your streak. Therefore, you can level to 5 on 2-5 to increase your odds of winning, but you always have to assess the situation. If you accidentally won a round because you fought against the weakest player in the lobby, you're still incredibly weak compared to the other players. Then you most likely won't win by just leveling to 5 next turn. So in that case, you just take the L and focus on hitting interest gold instead. The most important thing to understand about streaking is that it's one of the only 2 ways of generating a scarce resource in gold. Therefore, the one thing you want to avoid at all costs in the early game is ping-ponging, which means you are in a win-loss, win-loss, win-loss situation. In that case, you are gaining no gold from streaking, and losing out on about 5 to 10 gold in the early game. If you want to learn more about economy management to understand more about the importance of interest gold and streak gold, then check out my economy guide, where I go in depth on that subject. Items are a core part of TFT, and making the correct items will give you large power spikes. Knowing this, a big mistake a lot of players make is to be very greedy with their items, resulting in them having a ton of item components left on the bench. That's a lot of potential power not being used. In the early game, we want to use these items to generate more power. This is especially important if we want to win streak. The only issue is that we do not have access to our late game carry yet, but that's where item carriers come in. Item carriers are typically 1 or 2 cost units that can use the same type of items as your late game carry. For example, Jhin is a great item carrier for Aphelios, as he can use the same type of items as him. Another example is Malzahar, who is a great item carrier for Lux. In the early game, we put our late game carry items on early game carries. The job of them is to hold and use the items so we don't lose out on power, hence the name item carriers. This works the same way with tanks. You place your tank items on early game tanks and move the items to late game tanks once we hit them. There are a couple of things you need to be aware of before you make items in the early game though. The most important thing is who is going to be your carry this game, and what type of items do they need. Say you want to play Aphelios carry this game. He needs Rageblade and AD items like Deathblade and Hurricane. In that case, you can make any of those 3 items early, as you know you need them later. The second question is, do you have a good champion that can use those items right now? If you want to make Deathblade, but you don't have a single champion that can use Deathblade well, then it's generally better to wait, or to make an item you can use with one of the swords, like Giant Slayer, which both AD and AD item carriers can use. The third thing is, how will me making this item affect the rest of my items later in the game? For example, if you want to make Bramble Vest for your tank, but you know you need an Edge of Night later, then it might not be as good to make that Bramble Vest, as you will have to get another Chain Vest later. But if you don't need any more Chain Vests for your late game carry, then it's great to slam Bramble Vest, as you're gaining more power onto your board while not disrupting your late game carry items. The final question you need to ask yourself is, how will this item limit my options later? For example, if you slam Deathblade, you're pretty much forcing yourself into playing an AD carry that game. It's good to limit your options to a certain extent in TFT, as having too many options and no direction usually results in 8th place. Limiting yourself to only playing AD carries throughout the game is fine, as there are still a lot of options within that tree, but there are some AD carries that don't like every AD item. For example, Yasuo is a melee carry that wants more healing and survivability items like Edge of Night, QSS, Titan's Resolve, and BT. So if we slam Deathblade, it won't be the best item on Yasuo, so we are kinda dropping him as an option by slamming Deathblade. This is not necessarily bad, as Aphelios and Zeri love getting raw AD, so you still have a lot of great options left in that case. Before the game even starts, you get to pick your legend. There are 15 in total that give you different advantages. The way legends work is that they always give you one specific augment every time. For example, Aesol is always giving you one of these 3 augments on stage 2-1. It's always cutting corners if the 2-1 is silver, patient study if it's gold, and level up if it's prismatic. You don't have to pick these augments, as you'll be offered different ones as well, and you can also reroll your augments and ignore them altogether. If you like win streaking, the best ones are Caitlyn, Draven, Ornn, and Veigar. All of these legends offer augments that will give you immediate power, which is what you need if you want to win streak. If you want to lost streak, the best options are Bard, Master Yi, Pengu, Tahm Kench, and Vladimir. All of these legends either give you great rewards that synergize with the lost streak playstyle, either by giving you large rewards later in the game, or by giving you a ton of gold you can use to stack interest right away. The other new mechanic is portals, and I split those into 3 different categories. The ones that make it easier to win streak, the ones that make it easier to lost streak, and the mixed ones that change the game in other ways. It's easier to win streak on House Lightshield, Immortal Bastion, Noxcrea, Thresh's Sanctum, Shifting Sands, the Lavender Sea, the Sump, and Glask Industries. It's easier to lost streak on Yordle Portals, Scuttle Puddle, Shurima Bazaar, Targon Prime, and Ecliptic Vaults. All portals where it's easier to win streak, it is also harder to lost streak, and vice versa. How much easier or harder it is depends on the specific portal, but you shouldn't think that, oh, it's the Targon Prime portal this game, therefore I can't win streak. Instead, you should view it as, since it's Targon Prime, I won't get punished as hard for lost streaking this game. The last thing I want to touch on before we get into the best early game openers is how to actually make a strong board. Making a strong board is something you want to do in both lost streak and win streak situations. If you are playing a lost streak, you want to lose, but you don't want to get destroyed every fight. Therefore, we want to build boards that make our losses as small as possible to preserve as much HP as possible. We do this by playing units that have high damage against single target units. On the right side of this board are carries that deal a lot of damage to single targets. These will be excellent to play if you need to kill units. On the other side are carries that deal damage to multiple units, or to different units with every cast, since we will be weak when lost streaking. Focusing all our damage into one enemy champion will make it more likely that we kill units and save HP. But if you deal a bunch of damage to the entire enemy team, but don't kill any of them, we will be losing a lot more HP per loss. When it comes to building strong win streak boards, things are a little different. In that case, we want to build a board that has the highest likelihood of winning rounds, not killing individual units. To make a strong board in the early game, the most important thing you need is a strong frontline. This is because most fights are front to back in the early game, and tanks themselves deal a lot of damage in the early game. There are 3 core frontline directions you can take in the early game. You have Bastion, Bruiser, and Juggernaut. Once you have a strong frontline, you need a strong backline that can deal damage behind the tanks. Ideally, you want the frontline and backline champions to line up in terms of shared synergies, but overall, it's better to play 2 stars over synergies in the early game when your goal is to win rounds. Now let's move on to the strongest early game boards of set 9. All these openers will be available in an Imgur album for patrons and YouTube members, and the links to join those is down in the description. First up, we have Ionia Jhin. He is a great item holder for Aphelios and other ranged AD carries. Irelia and Set provide great frontline and also provide Ionia, and you can replace Ashe and Warwick with other units if needed. But this is one of the strongest early game boards with Jhin carry. From here, you ideally want to end up playing Aphelios, but ending up with a Yasuo comp can also work. Next up is Challengers. This comp is great for win streaking in the early game. Similarly to Duelist comps from previous sets, this comp can run through people if you're strong, but if you are weaker, this comp is not that great as you don't proc the Challenger trait if you're not killing units. From here, you can end up with Kalista reroll, or end up with Kai'Sa or Yasuo carry. Next up is another AD opener with Gunners. Our frontline is pretty similar to Jhin with Warwick, Irelia, and Set, but we can also run this with pretty much any frontline if the chem mod we get from Zaun is bad. From this spot, you ideally want to end up playing either Zeri or Urgot carry, and play more Zaun or Gunners in the mid game. Next up is an AP opener, where we are playing Void with Malzahar as the item carrier. You get a ton of frontline with this comp through Void, so at level 5 and 6, you usually want to add in more damage, usually by adding in 4 Sorcerers, and from there you will usually end up with a 6 Void Kai'Sa board or a Sorcerer Lux board. Next up is another AP board with a Shurima Bruiser frontline. You can run either Cassiopeia or Talia as your item carrier, but Talia will be the best most of the time as your level 5 and 6 are much better since you can add in Multicaster at level 5 and 2 Invoker at level 6. From here, you will usually end up with Shurima as here, or you can play Multicaster reroll and slow roll for 3 stars at level 6 and 7. Next up is Teemo. We can run pretty much any frontline with this. Since the Yordle trait doesn't really do anything unless your champions are starred up, we don't run that trait often in the early game. From here, we can transition into most AP comps. If it's not reroll Multicasters, we can still lean into Gwen or Azir late game. Lastly, we got Rogues. With this comp, you can run most frontlines, and you can use Viego as your AP item holder and Zed as your AD item holder. Rogues work kind of like Assassins from previous sets, where they will jump through the backline, but in set 9, they only do so once they hit 50% HP, so you want them to take damage fast in a lot of cases, as they also drop aggro once they jump. From here, you want to end up with Gwen carry if you have AP items, or Yasuo carry if you have AD items. Thank you so much for watching. If you learned something, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you want cheat sheets for any of my comp guides and other guides, they are available for YouTube members and patrons, and links to join those are down in the description. So take care, and see you in the next video.